Gesundheit began the Farbrengen today, that the reason for the Farbrengen today is self-understood that it is Shabbos Mevorchen. And as it was instituted by the Frierdiker Rebbe to make a Farbrengen every Shabbos Mevorchen. However, the specialty of this month is that it is Shabbos Mevorchim of the month of Kislev. Shabbos Mevorchim in itself can also come out on various days. It has to be the last Shabbos of the month, but it does not have to be necessarily the very last day of the month as it is this year. This year, we are going straight from Shabbos Mevorchim, from the month that the Shabbos that we're benching the new month, we are entering straight into the new month, right away into Kislev, because tonight is Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and as the Kviyas is this year, it is one day Rosh Chodesh, so the one day Rosh Chodesh is already Aleph Kislev, so right away we are going from Cheshvan straight into Kislev. And it is this Shabbos, when we bench the new month, that ties together the month of Cheshvan and the month of Kislev. Now here the Rebbe explains. Last year, we also had the same Kriyus, that Shabbos Mevorchim Kislev came out to be Erev Rosh Chodesh. In other words, we also went from Shabbos straight into Rosh Chodesh, but there was a difference as it is this year and as it was last year. What? Last year, we had 2 days Rosh Chodesh Kislev. So when we have 2 days Rosh Chodesh Kislev, the first day of Rosh Chodesh is still Lamet Chesh. So if true, from Shabbos Mevorchim, we went straight into Rosh Chodesh, however, being that it was 2 days Rosh Chodesh, so the first day of Rosh Chodesh was still in the month of Cheshvan. So it was not that we went from Cheshvan into Kislev right away through the Shabbos. We went from Shabbos into Rosh Chodesh, but Rosh Chodesh was still in Cheshvan, and then the second day of Rosh Chodesh, that is when the month of Kislev began. This year it is different. This year, we only have 1 day Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and when we know when it's 1 day Rosh Chodesh, so we go straight. So the date of the 1 day Rosh Chodesh is already a date in Kislev, and being that today is Erev Rosh Chodesh, we are going straight from Shabbos into the new month of Kislev. The Negeya last year, the way the Kviyas is, and Bechlal, going from Shabbos straight into Rosh Chodesh, the Rebbe says he spoke about it at length last year, and to explain the accomplishment, how different it is this year, due to the fact that it is only 1 day Rosh Chodesh, the Rebbe brought a medrash. While bringing the medrash, he says, how do Chassidim know medrash? How does it come to Chassidim to be familiar in the medrash? He says, this is a medrash which is quoted in Chassidus. And the medrash explains regarding 1 day Yontif and 2 days Yontif. Medrash explains that being that when we are in Goles, we have 2 days Yontif. Why? Because the Hamshoche and the Gilui Oyer, the great revelation which comes down when it comes to a Yontif, being that we are in Goles, we cannot absorb it within us as fast as it is in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, though in Eretz Yisrael it is enough 1 day Yontif, however, for us in Goles, we need a longer time to digest and absorb within ourselves the tremendous revelation of Kedusha which the Yontif brings to us, and therefore we simply need extra time. This is based on the Medrash, which is quoted in Chassidus. And here the Rebbe says, the same applies to the idea of Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh could be in 1 day, and Rosh Chodesh could be in 2 days. When we have Rosh Chodesh in 1 day, that means it is a higher madrega. That means that we are getting the same gilui, the same revelation which normally would take 2 days that we should absorb it. When it is 1 day Rosh Chodesh, it means we are getting these great inyanim of Rosh Chodesh within us, only within 1 day, and we don't need 2 days for it. So this is the advantage of this year's Kviyos on last year's Kviyos. And it expresses how we go right away from the Shabbos into the Rosh Chodesh and right away into the month of Kislev. The month of Kislev in itself, if we want to see the specialties of this month, Rebbe says we don't have to go far. Let us approach a 5-year-old child. He'll tell you right away what Kislev is so outstanding with. What is Kislev? In the month of Kislev, we have 3 tremendous inyanim. We have the inyan of Yud Kislev. That is the day when the Mittel Rebbe was released from prison. We have the day of Yutes Kislev, which is the day when the Alter Rebbe was released from prison. And we have the inyan of Chanukah. And all of these 3 great things we celebrate in the month of Kislev. What is equal in all the 3 of them? The idea of Oyer, of Lichtigkeit. Chanukah is expressed very simple. The whole idea of Chanukah is what? To take the Lichtigkeit and lahadlik al Pesach Beisa Mibachutz. Where do we light the Chanukah candles? We are told we have to light it facing towards the outside. What does this mean in the spiritual sense? That the whole idea of Chanukah is to take light, warmth, which this is Torah. Torah is Kinei Mitzvah v'Torah. That is the meaning of Lichtigkeit, is Torah and Mitzvah. And the Yontif of Chanukah reminds us and instructs us that we have to take this Lichtigkeit and bring it to the outside. In other words, we have to bring this Lichtigkeit to those Jews who as yet are not part of this Lichtigkeit and Warmkeit. To such an extent, ad the Kalya Riglo de Talmudoi. Expression in Gemara. Gemara uses this expression when the Gemara raises the question, until what time are we allowed to light Hanukkah candles? And the Gemara responds, Mishatishka Hachama, from sunset, until one did not light right away at the beginning of the evening. The Gemara tells us he may go ahead and light the Hanukkah candles at the Kalya Rigla de Talmudoi. What does it mean simply? Rashi explains, Talmudoi was a tribe of people in the days of the Talmud that they would walk in the streets very late. The Gemara says, until these, as long as these Talmudoim, these Talmuds are still walking the streets, we're allowed to light Hanukkah candles. After these Talmuds stop walking the streets, then we're not allowed to light Hanukkah candles anymore. What does Chassidus explain? Talmud is spelled Tov Reish Mem Vav Dalet. That's how we spell it. It's composed of the same letters as a moired, meaning one who rebels. So Chassidus teaches, the Rebbe mentioned it this afternoon, what is the whole goal of the Hanukkah candle? To wipe out and erase the Talmud, the one that rebels. In other words, we are bringing so much Lichtigkeit. The Lichtigkeit has to go to such an extent that even one who prior to him getting acquainted with the Lichtigkeit, he's defined as a Talmud, one who rebels HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The idea of Chanukah is that this Lichtigkeit reaches him and he becomes part of this Lichtigkeit, part of the Ne'er Chanukah, which really resembles the idea of Ne'er Mitzvah v'Torah. If we're talking about Yutes Kislev and about Yud Kislev, it's also days where we celebrate in Yonim that have a shaykhs to the spreading of Chasidus, and the spreading of Torah, and the spreading of Chasidus in particular, which this is also reflected in the idea of Lichtigkeit. So, looking at it in general, as a whole, what does the month of Kislev really stand for? It's a month which brings Lichtigkeit, spiritual light, due to all of these great dates which are in this month, outstanding events that have taken place. Yud Kislev, Yutes Kislev, and Hanukkah, this is a month which brings a tremendous amount of spiritual warmth and Lichtigkeit. Based on the Kviyas, as we just discussed, that the Kviyas this year is that the month of Cheshvan has only 29 days, because when Kislev has one day of Rosh Chodesh, Cheshvan has 29 days, as opposed to when Kislev has 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. That is when Cheshvan has 30 days. So when we look at various shiurim which we have, there are some shiurim which are divided according to the week. Let us say, for example, the Rebbe says, based on the shiurim of Chita. The shiur of Chumash, irrelevant how many days to the month, we learn the shiur Chumash accordingly every day. It's Parsha. 7 days in the week, and that's how the Seder is divided. However, regarding the shiurim of Tehillim and Tanya, here we know that every shiur is for the given day according to the monthly cycle. Naturally, the Rebbe says if one wants, he can go ahead and say Tehillim much more than the shiur of Chitas, but that's something in itself. It has no shaykhs to the shiur of Chitas. A person can say Tehillim and it's appreciated and welcomed at all times. But when we're talking how Tehillim is divided according to the Chitas, according to the 30 days of a month, we have to say every day these kapitlach for that given day. What happens when the kviyas is like this year, when Cheshvan has only 29 days? In other words, Cheshvan is a month that can have 29 days and can have 30 days, depending on the year. This year, the year that we are in, what happens to the shiur of Tehillim and to the shiur of Tanya comes out that on 29 days in the month of Cheshvan, we have a double shiur. We learn the shiur Tanya from 29 days in the month of Cheshvan, as well as of Lamed Cheshvan. The same thing in Tehillim. We recite the Tehillim today of Chavtes, as well as the Tehillim of Lamed. What does this show us? This shows us that there's an additional limud HaTorah. Though if we were to compare both years, this year and last year had 385 days. 385 days is the most days a year can have according to the Jewish calendar. So naturally, this means that there was more Torah learned in a year of 385 days as opposed to a year which only has 354 days as this year has. However, on the other hand, talking in the particular kviyas of the days that we are in right now, here we see that there is an addition in Torah in this day, this year, as opposed to the way it was a year ago. Remember, this shows us that these days, remember this, in terms of a hera, in terms of a lesson, what does this show us? This shows us that these are the days where we have to add limud Torah. Just like we find it in the basic shiurim, in the shiur of Tanya, in the shiur of Tehillim, this reflects that the whole idea of Torah these days, we have to learn Torah in a way of a safa, of adding on more. And here the Rebbe came to discuss another inyan, which we find by Esav. We find it in the Sedre, the end of today's Sedre. Vayelech Esav el Yishmael, vayikach es mochlas pas Yishmael ben Avraham achos nevoyes al noshev lo leisha. We find that Esav married a descendant of Yishmael by the name of Mochlas. So the Chazal comment, first when the Torah mentions her, she was mentioned as Basma. Why now do we refer to her as Mochlas? So the Chazal tell us, from here we derive that when one gets married, Moichlin loy al kol aveinosas, he gets forgiveness on all of his avers. And the Rebbe said, we see a remarkable thing. Who are we talking about? We're talking about a person like Esav. Esav. We know what Esav stands for. And Chazal tell us the various averos which he did these days. In other words, the days of him getting married. Esav's attitude led to the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to shorten the life of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu would have lived longer, but Chazal tell us he lived 5 years less in order that he shouldn't have tsar, he shouldn't feel bad seeing Esav's attitude. So here we are told that by such a person, and whom did he marry? Chazal tell us whom he married. He went to Yishmael. So Chazal say that was a peer. In other words, Esav went to found his liking. And that is what he found by Yishmael. And still we see, we're talking about an Esav. Whom is he marrying? He's marrying Yishmael, daughter of Yishmael. And still the Torah reveals such a tremendous thing, that what's happening? that when one takes upon himself to go and build a house, and to which this reveals the koyach ha'insoif. In other words, when one builds a house ultimately with the idea of being mekayim the mitzvah pru'urvu, such tremendous thing is accomplished that he gets forgiveness on all of his averas. Here the Rebbe says, what does this mean to us in the spiritual sense? There's a meaning. Every yid is considered a kala. Who is every yid a kala to? The chassan, the Rabbeinu Shalom. So there's some yidden that may say, how can I think of marrying the Eibishter? The spiritual sense. In other words, I'm very, very far from the Rabbeinu Shalom. Whole idea of marriage is that it leads to v'hayel basar echad. It leads to a total unity of a togetherness. He will claim, he calculates the position that he's in. He's so far from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he knows that Chazal tell us, man de machze b'mochi kama malke. It is forbidden that in front of the melech to go ahead and act freely. In other words, in the presence of a king, we have to act accordingly. So how can we tell this person, how can we be told that here we are marrying whom HaKadosh Baruch Hu? A relationship of marriage is being established between every Yid and the Eibishter. A Yid will say he's very, very far from this. He cannot live up to such a level of considering himself married to the Rabbeinu Shalom. And this is what the Torah tells us, that it is not so. How far a Yid may be. Here we're talking about a case, the furthest remote case, we're talking about Esav, and whom is Esav marrying? Is marrying the seventh of Yishmael. And we know all the Averas, all the sins which Esav did. Avodah Zarah, Gila Royos, Shvichas Damim. Esav did the worst. And still we see that he is told that on the day of his wedding, he gets forgiveness on all of the sins. This is what the idea of the day of the wedding accomplishes. The same thing when we're talking in the spiritual sense, which brings about the shaykhs between each and every Yid and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a marriage there. There's a spiritual association which is compared to the concept of marriage between every Yid and the Eibishter. And here we are told, when a Yid gets close to the Rabbeinu Shalom, to this extent of marriage, Rabbi spoke about this, spoke very loud, spoke with tremendous koch in this inyan. How each and every Yid really has a shaykh to get close to the Rabbeinu Shalom to the extent of a hayul basar echad. Just like we find by marriage, the same idea in the spiritual sense, the close relationship, the similar relationship which marriage brings about, can be created and should be created between each and every Yid and the Rabbeinu Shalom. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred to Rashi, and the Rashi which he discussed was a continuation to the Rashi which he discussed last week. Because the Indian actually has a shaykhus to this week's Chazarah as well. Because we find the beginning of this week's Chazarah on the pasuk of Eila Toldos. Rashi comments, Eila Toldos Yitzchak ben Avram Heila des Yitzchak, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made Tzar cluster Panav Shel Yitzchak, made that Yitzchak should resemble on his face Avraham Avinu. In other words, whoever saw Yitzchak immediately recognized that this is the son of Avraham. The Rebbe referred to what was discussed last week. Last week was discussed the ness which HaKadosh Baruch Hu made by the fact that Avraham and Sarah were able to give birth to a son Yitzchak. Avraham and Sarah were both elderly people at the time. Avraham was a 100-year-old man. Sarah was a 90-year-old woman. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu performed the ness that they were able to have a child, to bear a child Yitzchak. And the Rebbe referred to the end of last week's Sedre, where the pasuk tells us that after Sarah's passing, Vayesef Avraham Vayikach Isha Shmo Keturah. Avraham remarried to a woman by the name of Keturah. And with this woman he had 6 sons. And the Rebbe says, we don't find that the Torah should make an issue of the fact that Avraham Avinu had 6 sons, and when did this happen? 40 years later after Yitzchak was born. Because Yitzchak was married at this time. What age did Yitzchak get married? At the age of 40. So Avraham was at what age? 140 years old. So when Avraham was 140 years old, he had 6 children. And obviously, the Torah talks about them Rabbi added on today. We're talking about such children which they themselves also had children. Rabbi mentions the Shailah Shulchan Aruch when we're talking Nebuchadnezzar regarding one fulfilling the mitzvah of Pruah Vu. Shulchan Aruch raises the question: if one has children and these children do not have children, then the question arises: did he fulfill the mitzvah of Pruah Vu properly? In other words, when we're talking about mitzvah of Pruah Vu, it means having children and then on a continuous basis, that his children should also have children. The Mela, when we're talking here about Avraham, he had 6 children, healthy children, who they themselves also had children later. And the Torah doesn't make any mention that this is something outstanding, this is something which deserves special attention, it's an Indian of a nice. Also was discussed last week that the same time when Avraham and Sarah were helped with a child, this brought about a Yeshua not only to Avraham and Sarah, but this is what we read in Rashi, based on the pasuk Heinika Bonim Sarah, that Sarah was nursing children. She wasn't only nursing her own child, she was nursing other children, because at the big feast which they made, where the other Sarais, where the other dignitaries gathered, they all brought along their children, and these were also children who were born at the same time. In other words, when Sarah gave birth to Yitzchak, everyone else at that time who was around and was also an Akara, was also not having children, and next happened to them that they also began having children, that they also had children. And that is why they all came to participate in the feast which Abraham and Sarah made, and Heinika Bonim Sarah was nursing all of these children. So we gather in the whole discussion of Pashas Vayera that Sarah was complaining. She is an elderly woman, and she also said V'adoni Zoken. She also said her husband is old, and therefore how can they ever have a child when HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised them Yitzchak? The only thing we find in Rashi, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to Avraham Avinu, complaining, why didn't Sarah believe that they're going to be blessed with a child? HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not relate to Avraham what Sarah said, V'adoni Zoka, my master, my husband is old, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not want to create any friction between Avraham and Sarah. So he didn't want to say, relate to Avraham, Sarah's comment also regarding Avraham Avinu, whereby she said that Avraham is old. However, the emes is that Sarah and Avraham were both elderly people at that time, and here HaKadosh Baruch Hu performed a tremendousness. This inyan was discussed in last week's Farbrengen, and the Rebbe reviewed it again today, with some additions as we will get to in a minute. And the Rebbe also raised that a question was written to him that it seems like that at previous occasion, in previous years, there the Rebbe explained that the whole nest, the whole miracle was dependent on Sarah, not on Abraham. The Rebbe said her answer. And the Rebbe says usually when somebody wants to answer a question which is raised to him, the attitude is that he will follow the footsteps of big giants, of big trees. Ilone Ravreve, big trees. What does he mean? The Rebbe says he will prove that the same is done in the Torah of the Alter Rebbe. The Torah, which is commentary of the Alter Rebbe on the Sedras of the week. The winter Sedras, the Bereishis Shmois, Sefer is titled Torah. Vayikra Bamidbar Dvarim is L'chutei Torah. While mentioning it, the Rebbe says by Hasidim, this is referred to as the Hasidische Sedra. It says that's why there was always a custom of Hasidim, in addition to learning the regular Sedra, they would also study the Hasidische Sedra, fully or partially. In other words, that every week to learn some of the Mamarim in the Torah to have a Shaykhs to this week's Sedra, and then in the summer weeks to the L'chutei Torah that has a Shaykhs, the Mamarim that have a Shaykhs that are of that week's Sedra. So in this week's Sedra, in the Torah, we have a Maimah from the Alter Rebbe based on the pasuk Mayim Rabim Lo Yuchlu Lachabes Es Ahava, that the many waters, the strong waters, cannot distinguish the Ahava, the love which is in existence between the Eibishter and Yid. So what does the Alter Rebbe explain? What are we talking about Mayim Rabim? What do we mean the strong waters? Mayim Rabim, the Alter Rebbe explains, refers to the Ahava Rabbah. There's a tremendous love from the Rebbe to Yidden. And based with this idea, the Alter Rebbe goes through the entire Maimah and explains the pasuk of Mayim Rabim lo yuchlu l'chabes hasahava. So what do we mean by Mayim Rabim? By Mayim Rabim, we mean tremendous waters. What do we mean by water? Love. Tremendous love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to each and every Yid. What shaykhs does love have to water? Because based on what it's explained in Chassidus, that Mayim reflects an inyan of chesed, of kindness, and this is what Ahava is all about. If we take the same Torah the Rebbe says, and we go back a few weeks, not far, let us go back to Parshas Noach. In Parshas Noach we will find that there's also a Maimah there based on the same pasuk, Mayim Rabim lo yuchlu l'chabes hasahava. And what does the Alter Rebbe explain there? What is meant by Mayim Rabim? The Alter Rebbe explains that Mayim Rabim means a completely different thing. What does it mean? It means that there's a strong flow of waters. What is the strong flow of waters? This is the daigis, the tirdes haparnasa, which each and every one of us has, that we go through the worries of parnas, the worries of the gashmis, of providing ourselves with our gashmistic needs. And there the Alter Rebbe explains, though that there are Mayim Rabim, tremendous storm, a flow of waters, a storm of water, which interferes with our avodas Hashem, which is the daigas haparnasa, these waters lo yuchlu l'chabes hasahava, still there is the ahava, the love that is within each and every yid between him and the Eibishter. What do we see? We see the same pasuk from the same person, the Alter Rebbe. Within a few week difference in Mamorim of Torah, and the Torah was edited by the Tzemach Tzedek, and he brings completely different pirushim in the idea of Mayim Rabim. So what's the explanation of this? The Rebbe goes on. It means simple. We know that in Torah, there's shivim panim l'Torah. There are many, many ways to interpret in Yonim and Torah. And the same thing, there's the Inyan how we interpreted in Torah. The interpretation which he just gave last week, and continued on it this week, regarding the nes which HaKadosh Baruch Hu performed through the birth of Yitzchak. And there are other ways to explain it as he explained it in previous years. And we cannot raise a contradiction from one to another, because each and every one in its way is oisgehalten, is correct. And the Rebbe went on regarding the inyan of Avraham and Sarah. Rebbe explained that we find various types of miracles of nisim which HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes. There is a nes which HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes to an individual person, a one-time nes, and the nes has no continuity. Then there is a nes which HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes not only to an individual person, but he makes it to many. He makes the nes, and it affects many people. Let us cite several examples in the Sedrus which we are learning now. When Paroi took Sarah away from Avraham, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu plagued Paroi. So we find in the pasuk, HaKadosh Baruch Hu plagued not only Paroi, Hu va'avodah. He plagued Paroi and his entire crew and all of his slaves. Actually, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have plagued only Paroi, and the message would have been brought across the same way. No, we see the Rebishter had some reason to plague everyone there. The same we find by Avimelech. When Avimelech took Sarah, and later Rivka, not only he was plagued, but also Hu va'avodah, he and all of his servants and all of his slaves. The same in the positive side, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a nes, not only was this a nes which had an effect on Avraham and Sarah, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu made that this nes should have an effect on all the Akoros of that time. Especially, Rabbi said, based on the fact that Avram's name was changed from Avram to Avraham. Sarah's name was changed from Sarai to Sarah. What does this mean? Prior to her name change, her name was Sarai, meaning she was a master, she was to whom? Only to Avram. By changing it from Sarai to Sarah, she became a Sar l'kol ha'olam. She wasn't just limited to Avram, she became a Sarah l'kol ha'olam. Avram, prior to his name being changed, he was Avram. It had no meaning. Once the HaKadosh Baruch Hu changed his name, it became Avraham. What is Avraham? Av hamoin goyim nisaticha, the Rebbe gave him a father to many, many nations. Their personalities were changed after their names were changed. So if a nest happened to Avram and Sarah after their names were changed, from Avram to Abraham, from Sarai to Sarah, it couldn't have been a type of nest which would just have an effect on their own personal lives. It had to be something which had to affect the entire environment around them as well. Because they weren't just people who were living a private life for themselves. Abraham was an Avhamoin Goyim. Sarah was Moloshen Sar, Moloshen Sroras, Moloshen higher appointment. Not only to Avram, but she was a Sarah L'Kol Ha'olam. Therefore, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a nest, it had to affect everyone. So all the Akoros of that time were helped. Not only Avram and Sarah, it had an impact on everyone. If there was any Akora around, then they were all helped. However, the Rebbe says, it seems that this was not something which was going on for a long time. V'haraya, let us go some years later. We find by Rivka was an Akora. Rivka was the daughter-in-law of Avram and Sarah. And she was an Akora. To the extent that we find all the details in Rashi, that they both had to be mispalel. Each one stood in a different corner of the house. Yitzchak in one corner, Rivka in the other corner, and they prayed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give them children. What do we see from this? That it was a one-time thing which HaKadosh Baruch Hu helped Avraham and Sarah. However, this doesn't mean that anyone in later generations that had a shaykhus to Sarah was also helped from this nest. We need no closer shaykhus, the Rebbe explains, between Rivka and Sarah as we find in the Torah. Rivka, her daughter-in-law, we find that Yitzchak brought her into the tent. He brought her into the tent, which was originally his mother's tent. And we find in Rashi that many miracles which were going on in the days of Sarah. Ner Daluk, Merev Shabbos, Lerev Shabbos, her licht was going on from week to week. And all the other details, just like it happened to Sarah, happened to Rivka. However, the fact was that Rivka was an Akara, and the nest which HaKadosh Baruch Hu made to Avram and Sarah had no impact on Yitzchak and Rivka. However, it seems that B'negei Avraham, so B'negei Avraham, it did have an impact. In other words, Avraham already remained for all the years in the position of having children. In other words, the fact that Avraham had children 40 years later with a different wife, with Keturah, this, the Rebbe said, still came as a continuation of the bracha to Avraham. In other words, it helped on Avraham, but it didn't help on later generations. And therefore, the Torah does not make any issue of the fact that Avraham at the age of 140 had children, because this comes as a continuation to the fact of Avraham having children at the age of 100. When did Avraham take this additional wife? This he took after Sarah passed away. He didn't want to do it while Sarah was still alive, because Avraham figured he already had problems with Hagar. And we know that when Avraham married Hagar, though this came upon the suggestion of Sarah, still we know that it created by Sarah bad feelings, ill feelings. Memela, Avraham should go ahead and have more children, and remarry while Sarah was still alive and have more children. This is something which he didn't want to do. He didn't want to hurt Sarah's feelings. Now the question arises, why didn't this happen with Sarah itself? Could have had more children with Sarah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have, in fact, once HaKadosh Baruch Hu was making them necessary, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was leading to it that Avraham is having children. Besides Yitzchak, why couldn't they have had these other children with Yitzchak? So here the Rebbe explained, with Sarah. Thank you. Here the Rebbe says this is explained in a Rashi in Parshas Noach. Parshas Noach, Rashi tells us why HaKadosh Baruch Hu only gave Noach 3 children and not more. Rashi says, if they would be not behaving properly, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have to destroy them. So he would hurt the tzaddik. If they would be acting properly, they would be a burden that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have to do many good with them. Much toiv. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu only gave him 3 children. The same the Rebbe says, the same similar problem would arise here if the Rebbe would give him more children with Sarah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu already promised him, Be Yitzchak Yikara L'Chazarah. So who is really going to be his descendants as far as the Chshivas of Yikara L'Chazarah? It's going to be Yitzchak and his children. So therefore, even if the children, the additional children that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would give him, would act properly, it still wouldn't be real, the same equivalent Chshivas as Yitzchak had. If they wouldn't act properly, he would have to send them away like he had to send away Yishmael, would lead to problems. So that is why the Rebbe didn't want to give him any additional children at that time. It was only with Sarah that he had Yitzchak. It was only the fact, many years after Yitzchak was on his own, and after Sarah passed away, and after all that, Vayosef Avraham, Vayikach Isha Shmo Keturah. And what did he do with his children ultimately? He also sent them away Takir. He didn't want him to be around with Yitzchak and his children. And this is the explanation which we find benegay this inyan. While talking this inyan, the Rebbe referred to something in last week's Sedra, I remember correctly, which is in the parentheses in Rashi. The Rebbe says, why is it in the parentheses? Obviously, if it's in Rashi, it's from Rashi. The Rebbe says, nobody would ever dare, knowing the greatness of Rashi, to add something into Rashi which isn't from his Pirush. In later generations, nobody would ever have the chutzpah to do a thing like that. So if we do find it in a Rashi, obviously, it must have a shaykh. The Rebbe says, the way it seems to him, maybe could be explained. First of all, it may have been found in a different manuscript than the original Pirush of Rashi. Being it was found in a different manuscript, true that this manuscript also traces back to Rashi, but being that some manuscripts had it and some didn't, that it was put into parentheses. Another explanation, the Rebbe says, that similar to what we find by the Alter Rebbe. We find in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, we find that there are many inyanim in parentheses. What is the explanation given on it? That the Alter Rebbe Taka wrote it. The Alter Rebbe wrote it. However, the Alter Rebbe wanted to go over it again. In other words, he wasn't definite that it is so, and he waited for an opportunity to go over it again. Seems like this opportunity never came, so in the meantime, it was left in parentheses. Same thing the Rebbe says, perhaps this inyan, which is written in Rashi in the parentheses, could be something which Rashi intended to go over it again. However, being he put it in, thought it's appropriate, but he wasn't sure with it, that is why he left it in the Chatzor Eagle, he left it in the parentheses. It slipped my mind what the pasuk, on what Pirush it was. If I remember correctly, it's also regarding the fact that Yitzchak resembled Avraham. The Rambam, which has a shaykhus to today's Shio, according to the division of learning Rambam 3 prakim a day, which will lead to a siyum before Pesach, which is the birthday of the Rambam. Today we learn the inyonim, Rebbe says, which in Sedra we refer to it as Parshas Tahara. Which Sedra do we refer to as Parsha of Tahara? That is the Sedra of Mitzvah. Many don't want to refer to it by the name of Mitzvah in the negative way, so refer to it as Tahara. What is discussed in that parak? In that parak is discussed that who is the one that can define if a person has mitzvah or not. It is only a kohen. In other words, to label him tahir or tamei, no difference. This can only be done through a kohen. No one else, how learned he may be, how great he may be knowing the halachas better than the kohen. Still, he is not permitted to go over to the person and tell him that he is tamei or even tahir, whatever the case may be. What do we see from this in spiritual sense, the Rebbe says? We see tremendous things. That besides the one who is assigned to do it, nobody is allowed to go over and label a Yid and say on a Yid that he is Tamei. There is the Kohen, it is his Indian. The Torah gave him the power that he can define who is Tamei and who is Tahor. But Stam, for a person to go ahead and walk around, Rebbe described, and have nothing to do. And what is he going to do? He's going to talk bad on Yidden. He's going to say that Yidden want to stay in Golas, Yidden don't want to go out of Golas, Yidden are not looking for Geula. And just the individual who may be walking around and saying such type of thoughts may be a firm person, maybe a person who in his own personal life puts on 4 pairs of tefillin. And at the same time, the Rebbe says, he is not authorized to go ahead and say that Yidden are in a position of Tamei. On the contrary, by doing this is Lashon Hara. And this is what leads to the sin of Mitzayra. Chazal tell us what led to that one should become a Mitzayra. The fact that he spoke Lashon Hara. Memela, when we are talking here about how dear every Yid is by the Rebishter, and every Yid is extremely close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nobody has the authority to go ahead and label Yidden and go around and say on Yidden that these Yidden are Tamei. Really have no value. When does a button have a value? When the button is on the jacket. And in order that the jacket should give the proper appearance, that is when buttons are used. So we are already at the level where we're wearing our jackets, we have the proper, in other words, the levushim, everything is ready. All that we need is the final touch, which means the final touch of shining our buttons. And once we will shine our buttons, we will go through the final touch. This will take us totally out of Galus and bring us into an Olam, which is a beautiful and gloriful Olam, which is an Olam full of Getlachkeit, full of godliness, without Galus, but we will be brought into Geula, which as mentioned earlier, Geula is the same lettering as Galus, but all we do is we add an Aleph. And the Aleph stands for the Aleph Mishalaylam to the Rabbeinu Shalom. Thank you. Benegea the Rashi in this week's Sedra, Rebbe says there are psukim in Parshas Bolok which are discussed in the Rambam, in the Sefer Halachas of the Rambam. Though we know that the Rambam himself tells us that his Sefer is a Sefer, the Yad HaChazaka, is a Sefer of Halachas. However, at the end of the Rambam, the last 2 prokim of Hilchis Melachim Memulcham Esein, we find that the Rambam quotes there psukim of this week's Sedra of Parshas Bolok, and the Rambam teaches us these psukim. The Rebbe says it was already discussed in previous occasions. In some parts of the psukim the Rambam teaches like Rashi, other parts of the psukim the Rambam teaches different. Beginning from the pasuk after Shvi, Kapitel Chav Dalet, pasuk Yud Zayin. The Rebbe spoke about it with a big koch. It's just the Kohen who was given authority to do so. And the Kohen has to be a person who has to have love to each and every Yid. And this is what we find before the Kohenim go up to bench the Yidden, they make a bracha. A Kohen is supposed to bench Yidden and love each and every one of the Yidden. Rebbe says the halacha is, if a Kohen does not like Yidden, this is the halacha. He has no right to get up there and bench them. When can he bench them? When can he bench Yidden? Only when he's in the position of bi'ahazo, as he himself recites in the bracha, that he has an extreme amount of love to each and every Yid. Otherwise, he cannot bench them. And this is something, and the Rebbe gave the Kohenim also the power that they can decide. They are the ones that can evaluate who is Tahir and who is Tamei in the sense of a Mitzayra. But other than that, other than them, there's nobody else that can go ahead and label Yidden and go around and say that Yidden are not acting properly, Yidden are Tmeim, this you shouldn't do. If you can go ahead and help the person, fine. But to just go around and enjoy criticizing people, this is no Indian, this is no Derech and Avodas Hashem. Farbrengen, the Rebbe also referred to the greatness of a Chassidish Farbrengen. That there is a saying from Chassidim, that what a Chassidish Farbrengen can accomplish, Malach Mechol cannot even accomplish. Which this shows us how great a Chassidish Farbrengen is. Rebbe says, we find a source for it in Nigel and Gemara. There's a Gemara, the Gemara tells us, Gedoyla legima shemekareves. That when people drink together, it is mekareves, creates a closeness between them. And this is the whole idea of a hisvadus. Hisvadus also is based on a pasuk. There's a pasuk Hayelhu Shnayim Yachtov Bilti Imnoi Odu. In other words, the whole idea of Farbrengen is to bring closeness between the participants in the Farbrengen. This is what a Farbrengen is all about. So here the Rebbe says, however, there are those that interpret when we say Gedoyla Legima Shemekareves, that the power in drinking is great, that it brings close, that the drink has to be a big one. They learn Pshat, Gedoyla Legima. If it's a big drink, then it's Mekareves, then it brings close. Then it creates a closeness. And this, the Rebbe says, is not so. True, there is a Hasidic custom of saying L'chaim at a Farbrengen, which the idea of the L'chaim is, based on a Hasidic interpretation, that when a behem, the Gemara in Masechta Bey, I think it is, that is where the Gemara says that we drink, give the behemoth to drink before the Shechita. And the Gemara gives the explained, in order to remove the sircha, I don't know what a sircha is called. In other words, when there's something not smooth on the lungs of the behemoth, by drinking, it becomes smooth. That's what a sircha is called. In our popular language today, we know glatt kosher. What means it's glatt? In other words, that when the lungs of the behemoth are smooth and there's nothing, it's even and smooth. Halak, the glatt, yeah. Same idea. The Rebbe says the idea of saying L'chaim is that our Nefesh HaBahamis, our Yetzer Hara, to get away the sirchas, to remove anything which is there interfering in Avodas Hashem. True, the Rebbe says we say L'chaim, so we create it. The mood is created, so in case one says something to another person, and it's not said fully b'derech kavod, and it's not said fully honorable, and he's not treating him with the type of honor which the other one expects, so when it's after saying L'chaim, it is forgiven usually. However, to accomplish this, we only need a little bit of mashke. And the Taich in the Chazal, G'doyle Legima Shemekareves, is how great is this little bit of mashke that this can create a kiruv, this can create a closeness amongst the participants who are saying L'chaim. And this is the Pshat G'doyle Legima. And those, the Rebbe says, that think that by drinking a little more than a third of a cup or a half a cup, a little bit of mashke to say L'chaim, they think that they need more than that to say L'chaim in order to Farbrengen. This, the Rebbe says, does not stem from the Yetzer Hara, from the Yetzer Tov. On the contrary, this stems from the Yetzer Hara, and this is what we say in davening. We say Al Chet Shechatonu Lefanecha BeYetzer Hara. Rebbe explained it many occasions. What is the pshat Al Chet Shechatonu Lefanecha BeYetzer Hara? Every Aveir is BeYetzer Hara. Did you see an Aveir that's not BeYetzer Hara? Every Aveir is through the Yetzer Hara. Pshat is, there's some Aveiros which we create the Yetzer Hara. Even the Yetzer Hara, there's no Yetzer Hara that's telling us to do so. We go ahead and we create the Yetzer Hara. That the Yetzer Hara should talk us in to do this thing or that thing. Same the Rebbe says is regarding to drinking mashke more than we are supposed to, more than it is required. This goes into the category of Al Chet Shechatonu Lefanecha BeYetzer Hara. We are creating the Yetzer Hara, there's no need for it. When Mashiach will come, it'll be completely different. Then the Rebbe says, there'll be as ruach hatum ma'avim in ha'aretz, all the evil spirits will not exist anymore. And that is why Chazal say that the kois of David HaMelech, kois shel Mashiach, will be koisi revoya, will be a very large cup. So the Chazal say, how large will the cup of David HaMelech be? Revoya is spelled Reish Vav Yud Hey, which is a total of 221. It'll be an enormous cup which will be able to hold within it, the Gemara tells us, 221 lug. It's a very, very large size, tremendous size. So that's the Rebbe says, that's what we're talking when Mashiach will come. Then it will be a completely different time. However, when we're talking nowadays, we have to be careful. And when we say L'chaim, we cannot say more than a little bit of mashke, and all the tremendous accomplishments which a Chassidish Farbrengen leads to and accomplishes is accomplished with this bit of mashke, and there's no need for more. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe spoke behemshach to the inyan of mashpiyim, which he spoke about a few weeks ago in the Farbrengens. The Rebbe says that anyone who learned in Temchet Mimim has his obligation to go ahead and share his knowledge of Hasidus with others. We are told that we have to go ahead and spread the mayones of Hasidus. Spread the wells of Hasidus. While talking about the Indian of Mashke, the Rebbe added on, and mayon brings tahara b'kol shehu. We know if the Rebbe says, being that the whole idea of a Chassidische Farbrengen is to bring the Chassidische warmth, which comes from the mayon, which comes from the source of Chassidus. In halacha we find that b'negeya bringing tahara, there are various. For example, we know like a mikveh has to have memsa. If the mikveh does not have a shear of memsa, it's not a kosher mikveh. However, if one tovels in the waters of a mayon, of a well, there is no need for memsa. Mayon is mitahir b'kol shehu. Any bit of water from the mayon brings tahara as long as it covers the object who's becoming tahara from all its sides. It has to be kol gufay oila behen. The entire thing has to be covered. But there's no difference. There's no shear. The minimum amount of water that can cover this object that's getting tefillah, if the tefillah is b'mayon, brings tahara. So the same the Rebbe says when we're talking about it, bringing tahara in the Chassidische sense, the spiritual sense, which comes from a Chassidische Farbrengen. There is no need for more than a mashahu. And this mashahu, this bit, saying l'chaim on a little bit, this is what can have the fullest accomplishment which we want that a Chassidische Farbrengen should accomplish. Back to the Indian of Mashpiyim, the Rebbe spoke and quoted again what the Gemara, based on the Gemara, which was the famous Sikha from the Rebbe Rashab, the Rebbe Nishmasei Eden. Based on the Chazal of Kol HaYotzei LeMilchemes Beis David, Kaisev get Krisus LeIshtoi. Whoever is going out to join the forces of the Milchama of Beis David has to write a get to his wife. And his spiritual interpretation of it is, in halacha it meant that anyone that went in the Milchama, Bimei David HaMelech, wrote a get that in case he does not come back, his wife should not remain in Aguna. In the spiritual sense, the Rebbe Rashab interpreted it that today we are all participating in a Milchemes Beis David. We are all participants in the Milchama, in the war, which does not allow for the coming of Mashiach. And therefore, Kaisev get Krisus LeIshtoi means we have to divorce ourselves from Gashmi Yizdikei Inyanim and totally devote ourselves to take part in this war, in the Chayolei Beis David, to overcome the battle against those who are interfering with the coming of Mashiach. So the Rebbe says today that when the Rebbe Rashab spoke this Sikha, he addressed himself to the tens or perhaps hundreds of Tmimim who were listening to him at the time. Today this Sikha is negated to each and every one of us. And to each and every one of us, if we possess any knowledge in Chassidus, it is our obligation to go ahead and share this knowledge with other Yidden who as yet do not have the knowledge in Chassidus. And to go ahead and leave the yeshiva, after we left Yeshiva Temchet Mimim, put ourselves into a position of ish tachas gafnoi, v'ish tachas teinosai. In other words, what we will dream of, and our goal should be to have a peaceful life. In other words, this is an expression which we find in the Gemara. The Gemara describes what life looked like in the days of Shlomo HaMelech. The Gemara uses the expression, it was ish tachas gafnoi, v'ish tachas teinosai. Everybody lived under their vineyards and under their trees. They had a simple and enjoyable and pleasant life. The Rebbe says, true one, in the spiritual sense, it's something else. Tachas gafnoi, what do we mean by a vineyard? Yayin is misameich elakim va'anoshim. In other words, the idea of living under a vineyard in the spiritual sense is to bring happiness to other Yid. What do we mean by happiness? We mean spiritual happiness. But for one that will say he will want to live under the physical circumstances of tachas gafnoi v'tachas teinosai and not be interfered with having to go ahead and share his knowledge with others, this is not the proper attitude what we are supposed to do today for a mashpia. To lock himself up in his corner and say that he will not, and here the Rebbe said everyone is in the position of being a mashpia because everybody has the knowledge and Hasidus which we possess, and here we are told, we know that it has to be a futzu ma'inasecha chutza. It is our inyan to take these mayones Hasidus and go ahead and share it with other Yidden. This is our inyan. We have no right to lock ourselves up and hold ourselves back from doing this. I spoke very bitterly against those that hold themselves back. If they're in a position of sharing knowledge in Hasidus with other Yidden, they're in a position to reach out to other Yidden, and they don't do so, this is not what the Frierdiker Rebbe gave his life and gave his heart for Hafatzas HaMayonis, simply to be able to spread Hasidus wherever possible. And this is what it is demanded from us today as well. Here it seems like the Rebbe referred to an incident where he, after talking about the mashpiyim, that there's a need for a mashpiyah, for mashpiyim, seems like the Rebbe got a report that there was a meeting held, and the Rebbe was unhappy with it. The Rebbe says that he got a report. The report writes that there was a meeting held, and the meeting was held in a Hasidische mood, in a mood of Hasidische Warmkeit. And there were 10 people present. And naturally, wherever there are 10 Yidden, that is where the Shechina is. And the Rebbe says the idea of it is not to write him a report. The idea of it is that it should be brought down into action. And it seems like, the Rebbe spoke all this afternoon, it seems like that in the report they also included something about a budget for this type of a project or so. And here the Rebbe says this Indian has no shaykhs to geld. We simply mean the idea of mashpia and mushpa, one reaching out to another. The Rebbe says we're in Shabbos now. Shabbos geld is muktzah. We have no shaykhs to geld right now. Geld is an idea of the Egel Hazov, and this country says the Egel Hazov, geld is very, very powerful. But when we're talking about the idea of mashpia and reaching out to other Yidden with Hasidus, we have no thoughts of money in mind whatsoever. And the Rebbe was explaining, the Rebbe says, if you think that you will invite someone to a Chassidische Farbrengen and have him take part in the Chassidische Farbrengen, and your goal in this is, because you want that not on Shabbos Chas v'Shalom, but on Sunday you should be able to get an increase in the check for tzedakah, which you are getting from this person, and he should add an additional chai to what he would usually give you, and add more for it, this is not what he intends, and this is not what he means. Rabbi says what he means is simply, when you bring a Yid to a Chassidische Farbrengen, and you want to utilize your influence on another Yid, on an Indian Shel Chassidus, it has to be solely without any intentions of money or anything relating to it. You simply have a pure Hasidische intention to reach out to another Yid and to see to it that his Chassidus is improved, or his Chassidische acts are improved, or he gains knowledge in Chassidus, or gets a Kviyasitim and learning Chassidus and so forth, and not to have any other intentions whatsoever. There's no need to tie it in with other things, the Rebbe says. This is what he simply means. He means that everyone has to see to it to reach out to other Yidden, share our knowledge of Chassidus which we have, share it with others, and those who are capable of being mashpiyim, not to deny their qualifications, and to see to it that they have a shaykhus with other Yidden, and they are in a level of mashpiyah to those who are capable of being their mushpayim. Rabbi also spoke about there are several inyanim which are taking place today. Rabbi says when there are several inyanim taking place at one time, the question arises, which one of the inyanim has preference over the other? We know that there's a concept, tadir u'sha'enei tadir, tadir koidim, something which is constant and not constant. The thing which is on a continuity basis, on a constant basis, always gets a preference. Rabbi says there are several inyanim taking place this Shabbos. Rabbi says he will give, in the order of Chashivas, first of all it is an inyan which Orchim and Shluchim, people who are guests here, and these are the Shluchim, and here the Rebbe was referring to the convention of Shluchim, which is taking place here this weekend. Shluchim that have gathered from all over the country for a kinus, and this will be a kinus, referred to a pasuk. Vayakshev, it will definitely be in a format of Vayakshev Hashem Vayishma HaKadosh Baruch Hu will participate and listen. V'yikosav b'sefer Zakaron, it will be a fruitful bearing convention which will bring good and proper results. Another inyan which the Rebbe was referring to was to the pgishas which are taking place this weekend here. Then the Rebbe says there are other inyanim, there are an inyan which there are people here that are traveling to other countries, and it's also, in other words, to take from this Farbrengen to their trips which they are traveling to, and also the Rebbe referred to a Malava Malka which will take place next Mitzvah Shabbos, which is the Malava Malka for Neshek, which will take place next Shabbos night, for which the Rebbe gave mashke. Also, another inyan, which the Rebbe mentioned, this came after the first two inyanim, is the Suda Haidah, which is taking place tonight in 770, which this is the Suda which takes place yearly on this day of Rosh Chodesh Kislev. This is the day when 7 years ago, Schein Gedacht, when the Rebbe was not feeling well, it was after being for close to 5 weeks in 770, this was the day on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, when the Rebbe was the first time when the Rebbe went home. And this day is ever since celebrated by Chassidim as a Yontef. And tonight there is a Suda Seidoah, which means a Suda expression of thankfulness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is taking place tonight. For this occasion as well, the Rebbe also gave mashkin. So the Rebbe to help that the Rebbe should lead us and see us with us. Arichas Yomim V'Shonim Toives Ad Bias Mashiach Tzidkenu. A gute Woche.